It was the early hours of June 22nd, 1941, deep within the forests outside Smolensk. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sharp resin of pine trees, mingling with the faint metallic tang of spent bullets from earlier skirmishes. Captain Mikhail Ivanov, 45, a former lumberjack whose calloused hands once swung axes and saws instead of rifles, stood at the crest of the ridge, surveying the company before him. His men were a patchwork of weary farmers, mechanics, teachers, and laborers, each scarred by weeks of retreat and relentless German assaults. The Wehrmacht had pressed them hard, and morale was fraying like the worn edges of their uniforms. Rations were scarce, each man clutching his ration tin as though it held the secrets of survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Radio silence from headquarters left them isolated. The forest felt like a suspended world where every minute dragged, heavy with anticipation and dread. Ivanov's voice cut through the morning mist, low but resolute. "Gentlemen, we are not retreating. We will hold this ridge, and we will dig uphill if necessary." The men exchanged incredulous glances. Uphill. Against gravity, against every instinct for ease and efficiency. The task seemed absurd, almost impossible. Sergeant Pavel Sidorov, a wiry man with hands roughened from years of farm labor, spat on the ground and muttered, "Why not just fall back to the valley? They will come for us anyway. What good is a ridge if it kills us first?" His voice carried the tension of fear and exhaustion, a mirror of the company's collective anxiety. Ivanov shook his head, eyes narrowing against the first shafts of pale light breaking through the canopy. "If we dig along the natural slope, the Germans will zero in on us. They know where to fire, where the earth will offer the least resistance. But if we dig uphill into the blind side of the ridge, our trenches will be shielded from direct observation. They will see nothing, and when they fire, we will survive." The logic was unconventional, yet there was a grim genius to it, and the men understood deep in their bones that survival required such risks. They set to work immediately. Shovels bit into the earth, pickaxes cracked stubborn stones, and the groan of metal against rock echoed faintly across the ridge. Their muscles screamed in protest, fatigue already clawing at their limbs, while sweat mixed with dew and the early chill of June, freezing on brows and soaked into shirts. Some men worked in silence, lost in the rhythm of digging, their breaths rising in small clouds of mist. Others whispered prayers to saints, ancestors, and loved ones, invoking protection as they carved the hillside into defensive positions. The earth resisted them, roots snagging hands, stones tumbling unpredictably down the slope, and soil collapsing into the trenches as quickly as it was moved. By nightfall, the first line was complete. A crude, uneven trench snaking its way uphill, yet offering concealment and a measure of protection no valley or flat field could provide. Night fell with an eerie silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, listening. Ivanov walked the length of the ridge alone, the soles of his boots muffled against the soft earth. His eyes scanned the shadows, and every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig, set his nerves alight. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of trucks and the metallic clatter of engines hinted at the advancing German forces. Each sound was a countdown, a steady drumbeat announcing the inevitability of confrontation. Ivanov paused to kneel by a cluster of saplings, fingers brushing the rough bark as if seeking guidance from the forest itself. He drew a deep breath, inhaling the pine, the earth, and the faint, acrid smell of gunpowder carried on the wind. Somewhere beyond the ridge, enemy soldiers would soon unleash the terrifying roar of Katyusha rocket artillery. The first salvo would arrive with screaming inevitability, testing both the ingenuity of the uphill trenches and the resolve of the men who had labored to create them. By the dim glow of the moon, the company continued their work, reinforcing walls with branches and logs scavenged from fallen trees. Sandbags, salvaged from abandoned depots, were piled along the edges to absorb the shock of shrapnel and prevent collapses. Each man moved with a combination of urgency and reverence, knowing that the work they performed now would dictate who lived to see dawn. Lieutenant Sergei Morozov, the battalion engineer, moved among the men, adjusting angles, measuring depths, and ensuring that the incline would deflect blasts rather than concentrate them. 2 more meters here, he said, voice calm, yet commanding, gesturing toward a shallow depression. Dig until your knees are buried. We cannot afford mistakes. His expertise gave the men confidence, even as exhaustion threatened to sap their strength. Private Dmitry Kolesnikov, barely 19, wiped a smear of sweat and dirt from his brow, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Captain, will this really protect us from their rockets? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ivanov crouched beside him, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. It is not magic, Dmitry, he said. It is physics, determination, and courage. If we trust in our work, trust in each other, we will survive what comes. The earth will be our shield, and our ingenuity will be our weapon. Dmitry nodded, swallowing hard, and returned to shoveling. The rhythm of the pickaxe and the scrape of the shovel grounding him in purpose. As the night deepened, the forest seemed to pulse with quiet menace. The distant hum of engines grew louder, joined by the rhythmic thrum of heavy artillery being loaded and prepared. Somewhere far along the German lines, rocket batteries were being readied. The Katyusha, nicknamed Stalin's organ for its shrieking salvo, would soon send waves of destruction toward the ridge. Reports from scouts and intercepted communications had confirmed their presence. Entire companies had been obliterated in open terrain under less than half a dozen rockets. Yet here, in the uphill trenches, the men clung to hope. Hours passed, measured only by the occasional snap of twigs and the distant rumble of enemy movements. Fatigue weighed heavily, and some men sank into shallow depressions to catch brief moments of rest. Ivanov moved among them constantly, checking equipment, ensuring that rifles were clean, grenades primed, and communication signals clear. Every detail mattered. A single misstep could turn survival into disaster. By the first light of dawn, the ridge was transformed. Trenches ran uphill like scars on the landscape, zigzagging to follow the contour of the slope. Hidden dugouts connected lines, providing cover and enabling the men to move unseen from one position to another. Small lookout posts, camouflaged with pine boughs, allowed observation without exposure. The ridge had become a fortress, though one built not of stone and mortar, but of sweat, ingenuity, and desperate necessity. Ivanov paused at the crest, surveying the work. His face was streaked with dirt, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, yet they burned with determination. He thought of his family, long gone, memories both painful and precious. Every man in this company carried his own ghosts, but here they shared a singular purpose: survival against overwhelming odds. The Germans believed they could advance unchallenged, that their rockets and artillery would crush resistance as they had so many times before. But they had not anticipated ingenuity shaped by desperation, nor courage honed by months of retreat and loss. The first distant whine of rockets reached the ridge just as the sun broke through the canopy in pale, hesitant beams. The sound was eerie, rising and falling like the keening of a great metal beast. Ivanov gripped his rifle tightly, feeling the pulse of fear and adrenaline intertwining in his chest. He gave a low nod to his sergeant and lieutenant. "Positions," he commanded softly. "Hold fast. Trust the earth. Trust yourselves." Men sank into the trenches, rifles cradled, eyes sharp, ears straining against the roar that began to swell across the valley. Every heartbeat was amplified, every breath measured. The air seemed charged, vibrating with anticipation. And then the first salvo struck far below in the valley, the ground shivering under the explosion, trees splintering like matchsticks. Yet, on the uphill ridge, the company remained untouched, shielded by the slope and the labor of the previous night. Shockwaves rippled through the soil, knocking loose dirt and debris into the trenches. Men shouted warnings to each other over the din, but their voices were carried away by the roar of distant shells. Ivanov moved along the line, steadying trembling hands, offering terse commands, reminding each man to hold position. Hours stretched on, each one a test of endurance, courage, and faith in the unconventional plan. By midday, fatigue pressed heavily, but the uphill trenches had absorbed every wave of destruction. The German artillery continued, firing relentlessly, yet the soldiers of the ridge remained unscathed. Even as debris fell around them, minor injuries only grazed the edges of survival, never threatening life. The ingenuity of the uphill trenches, combined with relentless discipline, had created a fortress out of a simple slope. The men were battered but alive, their faith in Ivanov and each other vindicated in the harshest terms imaginable. The 12-hour barrage finally ceased in the late afternoon. Silence descended over the ridge, thick with smoke and the lingering scent of gunpowder. The company emerged cautiously, surveying the destruction below. The valley was scarred, trees felled, craters deep, but the ridge had withstood the storm. Ivanov allowed himself a rare moment of relief, his eyes sweeping over the exhausted faces of his men. They had survived, not by luck, not by conventional wisdom, but by daring to challenge expectations, to dig uphill when all reason demanded retreat. As the forest settled into an uneasy calm, Ivanov walked the crest once more. He traced the outline of the trenches, now silent witnesses to the bravery and ingenuity of one small company. In the distance, he could hear the faint hum of distant engines, perhaps retreating German forces, perhaps reinforcements yet to arrive. But, for now, the ridge stood, a testament to courage, creativity, and unyielding determination. The uphill trenches had not merely protected men, they had preserved hope, had bought precious hours that might yet alter the course of battle, perhaps even history. At 300 hours, the first distant thrum reached their ears. It was unlike any artillery fire they had faced before, sharper, faster, and almost musical in its cadence, rising and falling in terrifying crescendos that seemed to echo from every direction at once. Captain Mikhail Ivanov, 45, gripped his rifle tighter, sensing that the sound heralded a new kind of death descending upon the ridge. Private Dmitry Kolesnikov, barely 19, his first battle still fresh in memory, froze, mid-step, eyes wide, as he pressed himself against the uneven earth of the uphill trench. "Captain, what is that sound?" he stammered, voice trembling. Ivanov's jaw tightened as he looked out over the trembling line of men. "Stalin's organs," he said grimly, voice steady but carrying the weight of inevitability. "They will scream across this ridge, but stay low, hold your positions, trust the earth, trust yourselves." The soldiers instinctively pressed their bodies deeper into the trenches, their faces streaked with mud and sweat, hands gripping rifles as if the metal could ward off the oncoming storm. The first salvo struck with an ear-splitting roar. Explosions tore the earth around them, sending dirt and shattered pine needles into the air. Shrapnel hissed through the foliage, ricocheting off the steep incline of the trenches, leaving behind deep craters where entire squads on nearby ridges had been obliterated. The reports reaching Ivanov were chilling. Entire companies reduced to twisted metal and scorched soil, men buried alive beneath the upheaval of splintered trees and earth. Yet, here, in the uphill trenches, the Russian soldiers huddled, hearts pounding, breathing shallow and synchronized to the rhythm of impending death. The backward incline of the slope deflected much of the blast, the earth itself shielding the men's bodies, as though the ridge had been carved by providence rather than human hands. The second wave arrived moments later, the whistling scream of multiple rockets overlapping, creating a cacophony of sound that seemed to resonate inside the chest and teeth. Private Kolesnikov whimpered, but did not move, his eyes darting to the dirt walls around him. The trenches held. Every man dug deeper into the reinforced sections, sandbags cradling the walls, logs wedged into hollows, and the occasional fallen tree offering improvised overhead cover. The forest trembled under the barrage, trees groaning as branches splintered, birds taking flight in frantic, terrified flocks. Ivanov moved along the trench, boots crunching on pine needles and loose soil, pausing to check on each soldier, murmuring encouragement and giving terse commands. "Stay down, keep low, watch your mates. The earth will carry the shock, but only if you hold steady." he instructed, his voice cutting through the roar, each word deliberate and infused with authority. Hours passed in a relentless tide of explosions. The Katyushas fired in waves, sometimes dozens of rockets at a time, saturating the ridge with a storm of fire. Each salvo tore a swath of devastation through the landscape, toppling trees, ripping craters into the soft ground, and hurling debris in every direction. Soldiers on adjacent ridges, unprepared for the innovative uphill defense, were shredded or buried instantly. Here, however, the uphill trenches proved their value. The slope's backward angle absorbed the energy of each blast, preventing the direct shock from reaching the men fully. Ivanov moved from trench to trench, kneeling briefly beside men who trembled, placing a hand on shoulders, whispering words that carried reassurance and a reminder of purpose. "Remember why we fight," he said. "For home, for family, for every village burned behind us. The earth will protect us if we trust it. We have done the impossible, now we endure it." Private Alexei Morozov, 21, a former schoolteacher turned soldier, shivered as the concussion of a nearby explosion lifted loose dirt and stones, raining them into the trench. He dug his fingers into the soil to brace himself. I cannot feel my legs," he muttered. Ivanov knelt beside him, gripping his arm firmly. "Focus on your breathing, Alexei. Inhale through your nose, out through your mouth. Let the slope bear the fury, not your body. You are alive. That is proof enough." Morozov nodded, forcing himself to trust the earth and the ingenuity of their design. Around them, comrades maintained their positions despite the chaos, gripping rifles and readying grenades against any chance of infantry following the bombardment. The distinction between survival and death lay not in courage alone, but in the meticulous labor invested in the trenches overnight. The morning light, faint and pale, did little to illuminate the devastation. Smoke curled lazily from torn earth, mingling with the scent of gunpowder and scorched pine. Craters pockmarked the ridge and surrounding forest like open wounds. The German offensive, confident in its terrifying weaponry, had expected immediate annihilation. Yet, the uphill trenches, angled into the blind side of the ridge, had rendered the bulk of their destructive power impotent against the soldiers hidden within. Each man understood the gravity of their success, yet there was no time for relief. The Katyushas were relentless, firing in timed intervals to overwhelm and demoralize, and Ivanov knew that any lapse in vigilance could still be fatal. By mid-morning, the tally of rockets fired had surpassed 2,000. The forest transformed into a chaotic labyrinth of craters, splintered trunks, and torn earth. The soldiers' faces were streaked with grime, sweat, and the occasional blood from minor cuts, yet remarkably, the company had emerged without a single fatality. The ingenuity of the uphill trenches, combined with discipline and precise execution, had saved them. The slope's reverse angle deflected the worst of the explosions, and each man's adherence to orders prevented panic that might have exposed them to mortal danger. It was a testament not only to human ingenuity under pressure, but also to the resilience and trust forged in the weeks of retreat and hardship preceding this confrontation. Ivanov walked slowly along the trench line, inspecting walls, sandbags, and overhead cover. He stopped beside Kolesnikov, who was shaking violently despite the lack of visible injury. "You survived," Ivanov said quietly, voice carrying a rare gentleness. "Your fear is proof of life. Do not let it define you. The earth did its work, but so did you." Kolesnikov nodded, swallowing hard, still clutching his rifle as though it were a lifeline. Around them, the men emerged from shallow depressions to exchange brief glances, the shared understanding of their survival creating a silent bond, stronger than any words. By noon, the crescendo of rockets finally lessened, leaving only sporadic fire in isolated bursts. Silence, heavy and unnatural, settled over the ridge. The smell of smoke, gunpowder, and disturbed soil lingered, thick in the air. Ivanov allowed a brief moment to survey the devastation. Craters gaped in the forest floor, trees lay splintered across the terrain, and the paths leading to neighboring ridges were impassable. Yet, here, in these uphill trenches, the men stood relatively unharmed. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, but alive. They had survived a 12-hour barrage of the most fearsome weapon in the German arsenal, an assault that had obliterated countless others elsewhere. The captain moved to the ridge's edge, scanning the surrounding landscape for movement. German units would attempt to exploit any weakness, to advance now that the barrage had supposedly softened defenses. Yet, the uphill trenches remained hidden from observation, their angle preventing line-of-sight targeting. It was a rare and improbable advantage, earned through sweat, courage, and faith in a counterintuitive plan. He turned to his men, raising a hand for silence. "We have endured what few have. The ridge holds and we are still here, but stay vigilant. They will attempt to follow us next, and they must not find an easy path to our line." Lieutenant Sergei Morozov, the battalion engineer, moved among the soldiers, reinforcing weakened sections and checking for any compromise in structural integrity. He noted cracks in soil, minor collapses, and areas where sandbags had shifted under repeated concussions. Each adjustment was meticulous, a safeguard against the next potential wave of rockets or infantry assault. He nodded to Ivanov, acknowledging the combined success of engineering and fortitude. The uphill trenches were not just survival, they were a demonstration of tactical brilliance under extreme duress. The men allowed themselves brief rest, still within the trenches, but stretching cramped limbs and rubbing blood from small cuts. They shed water, whispered reassurances, and even allowed small smiles to flicker across their exhausted faces. Yet, the memory of the storm remained vivid. Explosions, screams, the whistling rockets, the violent tremor of earth. It had all left a mark on each man, a reminder of the razor-thin line between life and death in this conflict. As afternoon settled over the forest, the company began minor repairs, shoring up walls with logs and additional earth, filling shallow craters to prevent enemy infantry from using them as cover and camouflaging the trenches with pine boughs. Each movement was careful, deliberate, a mixture of necessity and precaution. Ivanov walked the length of the line again, offering words of guidance and encouragement, ensuring every soldier understood the importance of maintaining their positions even after the barrage. By late afternoon, scouts reported distant movement in the German lines, hesitant and cautious. The commander allowed himself a brief sense of pride, though tempered by the knowledge that this was merely the first phase of the engagement. The uphill trenches had proved effective against the Katyushas, yet the battle was far from over. Infantry and mechanized units would attempt to advance, and the men must remain ready. Still, in that moment, Ivanov allowed a rare smile to touch his lips. The unconventional strategy, the uphill trenches, had defied expectations, shielded the men, and preserved their lives. The ridge stood, battered, but unbroken, a fortress of earth and courage. The soldiers, though weary, shared a quiet acknowledgement of their improbable survival. They had faced a 12-hour hell of screaming rockets and emerged unscathed. It was a testament to ingenuity, discipline, and the unyielding human will to survive against seemingly insurmountable odds. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the cratered landscape. Ivanov stood at the crest once more, surveying both his men and the devastation below. The forest, once green and serene, was now scarred, yet here, in these uphill trenches, life had endured. The captain felt the weight of history pressing gently upon him. In a war defined by death and destruction, a small company's courage and unconventional thinking had carved out a pocket of survival. It was a victory measured not in territory, but in the sheer improbability of living through the storm. Lieutenant Sergei Morozov, the battalion's engineer, emerged from the command post with a grim satisfaction that belied the exhaustion etched into his 27-year-old face. Maps and sketches clutched in his hands detailed the ridge, the trenches, and the angles of artillery fire, all annotated with the meticulous precision of a man who had spent nights awake calculating probabilities that could mean life or death. "The uphill trenches worked," he announced to Captain Mikhail Ivanov, 45, and the gathered company, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that underscored the severity of their circumstances. He spread the maps across the command table, fingers tracing lines, showing the slope's reverse angle, the placements of logs and sandbags, and the sections where natural rock formations had been leveraged to reinforce the walls. "The slope redirected the blast," he continued, voice low but firm, "prevented direct lines of shrapnel and even reduced crater impact within the trench. Only a few superficial injuries from falling debris, nothing like the valleys, nothing like the carnage elsewhere." The men exchanged glances, some nodding, others silently absorbing the significance of his words, their breaths still short from the previous bombardment. Sergeant Pavel Sidorov, a wiry man with hands calloused from decades of farm labor, let out a hoarse laugh, shaking dirt from his uniform. "You risked our lives on a theory, and it worked. You'll be a legend in Moscow," he said, the humor brittle yet genuine, breaking briefly through the tension. His grin faded as he looked around the trench line, taking in the damaged but surviving men, the makeshift repairs, and the jagged craters that dotted the ridge. Each scar in the earth told a story of survival, of ingenuity applied under pressure, and of lives spared through a combination of quick thinking and sheer endurance. Even the youngest soldiers, barely 18, nodded in respect to Morozov, whose plans had kept them alive when conventional strategy might have led to certain annihilation. But there was no time for celebration. The distant rumble of German artillery signaled that their enemy was regrouping, preparing to encircle the ridge. Ivanov knew that the uphill trenches, while remarkably effective, could only hold for so long without constant adaptation. The company moved with fevered urgency, hauling sandbags from supply piles, reinforcing timber supports that had splintered under repeated blasts, and digging lateral dugouts to serve as shelters and observation posts. Hidden tunnels were cut carefully, linking the main lines to prevent isolation in the event of localized strikes. Every action was calculated, a balance between preserving the men's strength and maximizing defensive advantage. Sweat mixed with the dirt on their faces, hands blistered from shovels and axes, and yet the company pressed on, understanding that the ridge's survival depended on both the ingenuity of its design and the labor of those who inhabited it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The uphill trench design, conceived during nights of strategizing under flickering lanterns, proved even more advantageous as the day progressed. The Germans, expecting entrenched soldiers at the bottom of the slope, fired with predictable precision into what they assumed were exposed positions. Instead, Russian soldiers emerged from concealed lateral positions hidden by the blind angles of the reverse slope and fired back with lethal accuracy. Mortar teams, camouflaged by branches and moss, picked off advancing infantry, while machine gunners utilized the dead zones to cover flanks without exposing themselves. Every volley of Katyushas that rained down on the ridge further entrenched the soldiers' survival. The paradox was evident but undeniable. The very weapons designed to annihilate them instead reinforced their position, carving craters that could be used as temporary cover and slowing the advance of enemy mechanized units. Morozov's calculations had anticipated much of this, yet the soldiers' quick adaptation and fearless execution of tactics were equally critical to the outcome. Captain Ivanov moved along the trench lines, inspecting the defenses and issuing precise orders. "Reinforce the northern approach," he commanded, gesturing to a sector where debris had shifted from the previous barrage. "Fill the lateral dugout near the second crag and ensure that every foxhole has an escape path. No man fights in isolation, no man is expendable." His voice carried authority tempered by an acute understanding of human limitation. The soldiers obeyed with efficient precision, carrying heavy sandbags up the incline, shoring up walls, and whispering brief updates on structural integrity. The men worked as a single organism, synchronized by necessity, each aware that the survival of their comrades depended on their vigilance and skill. Private Kolesnikov, now slightly steadier after the ordeal of the previous night, labored beside Alexei Morozov, 21, placing logs and packing earth to reinforce a weakened wall. "I never thought digging uphill would save us," Kolesnikov muttered, voice trembling as he maneuvered a particularly heavy log into place. Alexei chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Neither did I. But here we are. The ridge holds, and we hold with it." Their brief exchange was interrupted by a sudden jolt as a distant shell exploded nearby, rattling loose earth above them. The men instinctively pressed themselves lower, and Ivanov's hand swept over their shoulders in silent reassurance. Survival, in this instance, demanded discipline equal to courage, a lesson etched into every muscle and nerve. Morozov paused at one of the main lateral tunnels, crouched to assess its stability. The timber supports had been scorched by shrapnel, and some of the earth had begun to crumble into the passageway. He adjusted braces with methodical care, measuring the incline of the slope and estimating the pressure distribution. "If this collapses, we lose the northern flank," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Nearby, Ivanov approached, watching the lieutenant's work with keen interest. "You think too much like an engineer," Ivanov said, voice tinged with dry humor. Morozov looked up, face smudged with dirt and sweat, and replied evenly, "And not enough like a soldier, Captain. Yet, both are necessary to survive." Their brief exchange encapsulated the unusual marriage of intellect and action that defined the day, a fusion of theoretical design and practical execution under fire. As the afternoon sun rose higher, the ridge became a hive of activity, each sector manned and reinforced. Scouts crept along the perimeter, camouflaged against the broken landscape, reporting movement and estimating enemy strength. Machine gunners adjusted sights to account for new angles, while riflemen coordinated overlapping fields of fire. Mortar teams shifted positions slightly, maximizing coverage while minimizing exposure. Each decision was a blend of necessity, creativity, and instinct honed by weeks of retreat and preparation. The uphill trenches were no longer just a defensive measure. They had become a dynamic network of survival, a living system that adapted to every threat, every explosion, every adjustment of enemy tactics. Ivanov paused at the crest, surveying the scene with eyes that had grown accustomed to assessing danger in seconds. He noted the distribution of troops, the reinforced sections, and the hidden lateral tunnels. The slope, which at first seemed counterintuitive, had proven its worth in the most brutal terms imaginable. By redirecting the energy of artillery, hiding personnel from direct lines of fire, and offering unexpected vantage points, the uphill trenches had transformed a vulnerable position into a fortress. "This ridge will hold," he whispered to himself, the words a quiet affirmation in the midst of chaos. Around him the men carried on, unaware that their captain's confidence was as much a shield as the earth beneath their feet. Even as the day progressed, the Germans attempted to adjust, bringing forward infantry, reconnaissance units, and light artillery to probe the ridge. Each advance was met with precise, disciplined counterfire from positions the enemy had assumed empty or lightly defended. Kolesnikov and his comrades ducked behind log-reinforced walls, firing into blind spots, sometimes venturing just enough to disrupt enemy formations without exposing themselves. The ingenuity of their defensive design became increasingly apparent. Dead angles, concealed lateral trenches, and overlapping fields of fire allowed a company of barely 100 men to resist far larger forces. Each successful maneuver reinforced morale, a rare commodity in the crucible of battle, and instilled a cautious confidence that the ridge, against all odds, could withstand repeated assaults. By early evening, the soldiers allowed brief moments of respite, tending minor wounds, drinking water, and whispering reassurances to one another. They maintained readiness while sharing fleeting observations about the ridge's transformation. Where, once, they had feared exposure to the relentless Katyushas, the craters left behind now offered temporary cover. The soldiers adapted, leveraging the destruction as an asset rather than a hazard. Ivanov moved quietly among the men, acknowledging their efforts with nods, brief words of encouragement, and occasional corrective instructions to maintain the structural integrity of their defenses. As twilight approached, the ridge assumed an eerie calm. Smoke lingered over splintered pine, the earth bore the scars of relentless bombardment, and the distant rumble of enemy engines suggested that the Germans were reconsidering the efficacy of a direct assault. Yet, Ivanov knew better than to rely on hope alone. The uphill trenches had proven effective, yes, but the battle was far from won. Every man remained alert, every foxhole reinforced, and every lateral tunnel checked for weaknesses. The company understood that survival required continuous adaptation, a combination of ingenuity, courage, and faith in both human planning and the unpredictable protection of the earth itself. Morozov returned to the command post to update Ivanov on the structural assessments of the trenches. The northern section still bears stress, he noted, indicating a shaded region on his map. If we reinforce it with additional logs and redistribute sandbags, we can maintain integrity through another wave. The southern lateral tunnel is stable, but minor adjustments to the exit are recommended to prevent collapse under bombardment. Ivanov nodded, approving the measures while noting that manpower would be stretched thin. "We will rotate teams and maintain constant vigilance," he said. "Our ingenuity is only as strong as the hands executing it." Night fell over the ridge, and a dim moon cast shadows across the cratered landscape. The men remained in their positions, alert and exhausted, yet infused with a rare and hard-earned confidence. Their survival against overwhelming odds and the firepower of the enemy had been ensured not by luck alone, but by the thoughtful application of ingenuity under pressure. Each soldier understood that the next day might bring another storm of rockets, another test of endurance, yet the uphill trenches had taught them that innovation, discipline, and collective effort could turn a seemingly doomed position into a fortress. Ivanov surveyed his men one last time before descending into the command post. They were battered, dirty, and weary, but alive. Their eyes reflected a mixture of relief, pride, and cautious anticipation. Morozov joined him, reviewing the maps one final time, ensuring that all measures had been accounted for and every weak point addressed. The ridge, scarred and battered, had become more than a line of defense. It was a testament to human ingenuity under the most extreme pressure, a monument to the resilience of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. As the stars began to glimmer in the darkened sky, Ivanov allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The uphill trenches had turned the tide of survival, preserved lives, and challenged every expectation of conventional warfare. Tomorrow would bring new tests, but for now, the company rested, ready to endure whatever the relentless conflict might throw at them next. And, in the quiet moments before sleep, amidst the whispers of wind through shattered pines, each man understood the profound truth that ingenuity, courage, and faith in each other and in the earth beneath them could withstand even the most unthinkable onslaughts. The first rocket struck shortly after midnight, their shrill whine slicing through the stillness of the Smolensk forest. Captain Mikhail Ivanov, 45, braced himself against the edge of the trench, listening as the first salvo tore through the hillside. The explosions were unlike anything the men had experienced in previous engagements, reverberating through the earth, hurling dirt and shattered pine needles into the air, and shaking the trenches as if the mountain itself had become a living weapon. Private Dmitry Kolesnikov, 19, barely able to steady his rifle, pressed against the rear wall, eyes wide with fear. He gagged as a wave of dust and soil rained over him, the acrid scent of gunpowder and exploded rock filling his nostrils. Sergeant Pavel Sidorov, grim and unflinching, leaned over to steady him. "Keep your head down, Dmitri. It is only noise, only death's theater, and we are actors, surviving its script." The men exchanged quick glances. the silent agreement passing among them. Retreat was impossible, and survival demanded endurance, discipline, and faith in the uphill trenches that had saved them the previous day. The first hour stretched endlessly. Rockets screamed from the German positions, their trajectories precise, yet miscalculating the unconventional slope of the ridge. Earth exploded above, around, and below them, sending sprays of mud and rock into the foxholes. Morale flickered as men flinched with every concussion, some vomiting, others stiff with terror, yet none abandoned their posts. Ivanov moved along the trenches with measured steps, inspecting the men, whispering words of encouragement and giving precise orders. "Hold fast. Every second is precious," he urged. "Each explosion that misses us is a victory. Each moment we stand here is time given to the Red Army to regroup and strike back. We are the shield. We are the first wall, the one they must burn through before reaching Moscow." The men nodded, swallowing fear and pain, reminding themselves that the ridge was more than soil and timber. It was a lifeline for thousands miles away, a barrier to the enemy's relentless march. By the second hour, the continuous roar of explosions had transformed the ridge into a chaotic storm. Trees splintered and toppled like kindling under the repeated bombardment, their shattered forms crashing into craters that swallowed foxholes whole. Weapons jammed from grit and mud, rations became sodden, and sleep was impossible. Yet Ivanov's presence instilled calm. He moved with a quiet authority, ensuring shifts in duty, rotating men from parapets to dugouts so that each soldier could rest for brief periods while the others maintained fire and observation. Lieutenant Sergei Morozov, 27, coordinated reinforcements to the lateral tunnels and supporting walls, ensuring that the structure of the uphill trenches held against the relentless bombardment. Every calculation mattered, every brace, every sandbag, every timber adjustment was a battle against collapse, a contest between human ingenuity and the raw, destructive force raining upon them. Fatigue became a palpable presence as hour 4 approached. The men's muscles ached from bracing against the explosions and lifting heavy debris to reinforce weakened sections. Voices cracked from shouting over the roar, and the scent of gunpowder, earth, and sweat permeated every breath. Yet Ivanov's reminders were steady and unwavering. "Breathe through the chaos," he told them. "Focus on the earth beneath you, the walls surrounding you, and the comrades at your side. Every moment we endure, every wound we suffer, delays their advance. Every second gives our comrades in the Red Army strength to strike back." The soldiers clung to his words like a life raft, repeating them to one another, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in shouts that competed with the detonations above. By hour 6, discipline teetered on the edge of collapse. The relentless bombardment had fractured sleep cycles and exhausted bodies, but even as men groaned with fatigue, they held positions, clinging to the uphill trenches that had become both armor and prison. Morozov checked the lateral tunnels, ensuring they remained intact, while Kolesnikov and Alexei Morozov, 21, hauled sandbags to reinforce weak sections. The rockets continued to scream, their cadence relentless, sometimes in terrifying volleys of 10 or 12 at a time, saturating every visible inch of the ridge. The explosions left craters large enough to engulf 2 or 3 men, sending soil cascading over timber supports and threatening to collapse partially constructed parapets. Yet, remarkably, the trenches absorbed the worst of it, the upward slope dissipating energy, hiding soldiers from the direct blast and creating pockets of relative safety amid the chaos. Captain Ivanov moved from foxhole to foxhole, pausing briefly at each man to assess their condition. He noted a young recruit, barely 17, his uniform torn and smeared with mud, clinging to his rifle with shaking hands. Ivanov knelt, steadying the boy's grip. "Focus on the angle, the incline, and the earth. The slope protects. Trust it. Trust yourselves." The recruit swallowed hard, blinking tears into the dirt-streaked face, and nodded. Around him, the men repeated the mantra silently, reinforcing morale with determination born not of comfort but necessity. Every explosion, every scream of timber or earth became a measured pulse of survival. Each man knew that holding the ridge was less about victory than endurance, less about killing than existing through the storm. The 7th hour blurred into the 8th. Time lost meaning amid the continuous roar of Katyushas, the staccato crack of rifles, and the intermittent screams of men in other sectors unable to find cover. Here, within the uphill trenches, soldiers survived, against all odds, even the wounded, minor though most were, pressed on. Bandages were improvised from scraps of uniform and torn canvas, while adrenaline pushed men to continue shoring up the ridge despite deep fatigue. Ivanov ensured rotation, but the urgency of reinforcing each line was ever present. Collapse, at any point, could render their position untenable, giving the Germans a chance to overrun the ridge, and Ivanov's experience as a former lumberjack lent him a keen sense of which timber could withstand the assault, which sandbags needed replacement, and where to dig small buttresses to prevent soil from giving way. By hour 9, the ridge bore the full brunt of the storm. Rockets skimmed dangerously close, detonating in lower valleys, sending sprays of earth and rock over the terrain. But the uphill slope absorbed the shocks with remarkable efficiency. Soldiers began to sense a rhythm amid the chaos. Each explosion was a measured hazard, each moment a test of patience, endurance, and ingenuity. Ivanov moved along the parapets, whispering instructions, offering encouragement, and correcting any deviation from the defensive protocols. "Do not lose focus," he said. "Do not let fear control you. The earth is our ally, and every man on this ridge is part of its strength." Morale, though strained, held. The soldiers knew the alternative to discipline was death. Hour 10 brought another wave of intense pressure. Trees groaned under repeated impacts, their roots tearing free, leaving jagged craters in the soil. The men's arms ached from lifting sandbags, shovels slipped from sweaty hands, and weapons jammed from mud and residue. Yet, the uphill trenches, with their reverse incline, allowed soldiers to fire back at the enemy without exposing themselves. Riflemen, machine gunners, and mortarmen took advantage of concealed angles, striking at German scouts who probed too closely, all while remaining shielded by the natural protection of the slope. Even the youngest recruits, their faces streaked with soot, adapted quickly, learning to exploit dead zones, cover themselves behind splintered timber, and reinforce positions under fire. The slope, initially a theoretical innovation, had become a battlefield reality, proving that calculated ingenuity could withstand even 12 hours of near-continuous assault. By hour 11, the intensity of the barrage began to wane, though each explosion still rattled the nerves of the men. Ivanov encouraged them to remain vigilant, to continue reinforcing weak sections, and to keep their eyes on the horizon. "We are almost through," he said, voice calm but resolute. "Do not relax until the last rocket falls. Every second counts. Every man alive counts." Soldiers shared brief water and food rations, though many packs were soaked and muddy. Yet they persevered, driven by the knowledge that their endurance had delayed the enemy and that survival depended on continued discipline. Each man's effort was crucial. A single lapse could undo hours of resistance. Hour 12 arrived, with a final, deafening series of explosions. Craters swallowed remnants of foxholes, yet the uphill trenches held. The German rockets, precise but unable to adjust to the unconventional defensive slope, detonated in the valleys below, sparing the men who had endured the onslaught. Silence gradually replaced the roar, leaving the ridge echoing only with the moans of the wounded in other sectors and the quiet, labored breathing of those who had survived the full 12 hours. Ivanov moved among his company, inspecting each man and trench, ensuring that the structural integrity had remained intact. Faces blackened with soot, bodies aching from exertion and concussion, the soldiers remained upright. The ridge had not only survived, it had prevailed through discipline, ingenuity, and sheer determination. As dawn crept over the horizon, the men emerged from their foxholes, moving cautiously across the cratered landscape. Ivanov counted heads, relieved to see that his entire company remained intact. Some men laughed weakly at their endurance, while others simply sank to the ground, too exhausted to speak. Kolesnikov, Alexei Morozov, and the youngest recruits stood together, surveying the ridge that had held them through the longest hours of their lives. Weapons were cleaned, wounds tended with whatever medical supplies remained, and the men quietly acknowledged that they had witnessed something extraordinary. 12 hours of relentless bombardment, surviving intact, bodies aching but spirits unbroken. Morozov examined the trenches, noting which sections had held firm and which required repair before the next engagement. Timber supports had splintered but largely remained effective. Sandbags, though soaked, had prevented collapse. Small lateral tunnels had endured, providing paths for rotation and retreat if necessary. Ivanov, walking along the parapet one last time, surveyed the ridge in its cratered, scarred state. The earth itself bore witness to the ingenuity and endurance of the men who had fought upon it. The uphill trenches were more than fortifications. They were a testament to human ingenuity under extreme duress, a lesson that survival depended not only on courage, but also on creativity, preparation, and unwavering collective effort. As the morning sun rose, casting long shadows over shattered pines and cratered soil, the soldiers allowed themselves a moment of rest. The 12-hour barrage had ended, leaving behind a quiet stillness that felt almost unnatural after such sustained destruction. Ivanov addressed his men, voice firm but filled with pride. "You endured what many would call impossible. You held the ridge when all around us fell. Today, each of you proved that discipline, courage, and ingenuity can overcome even the most relentless assault. Remember this moment. Remember how you stood together. Moscow lives another day because of what we accomplished here." The men nodded, some too exhausted to speak, others whispering their agreement. Their eyes, though bloodshot and tired, shone with the quiet satisfaction of survival and achievement. In the following hours, the company began repair work, shoring up the trenches, redistributing sandbags, and marking paths through the cratered terrain to prevent missteps. Weapons were cleaned and checked, ammunition counted, and ration packs salvaged where possible. The wounded, though minor compared to other sectors, were tended with careful attention, each man given what care was available. Ivanov ensured that the lessons learned during the 12-hour ordeal were preserved: the effectiveness of the uphill trenches, the value of rotation and rest, the necessity of lateral tunnels, and the importance of calm, coordinated response under relentless pressure. By midday, the ridge, though battered, stood firm. The soldiers moved more confidently, recognizing the power of preparation, ingenuity, and teamwork. The scars on the earth mirrored the scars on their bodies, yet both bore the same mark: survival. Ivanov allowed himself a brief moment to reflect, realizing that the endurance of his company during the 12-hour barrage was a defining moment, not only for the ridge, but for the broader struggle against an enemy who underestimated the resilience of men willing to fight against impossible odds. The uphill trenches, born from necessity and sharpened by ingenuity, had become a living monument to human perseverance. The German advance had been delayed by 12 crucial hours, giving Moscow time to reinforce defenses and redeploy entire divisions. Captain Mikhail Ivanov, 45, and his company emerged from the uphill trenches, faces blackened with soot, bodies aching, yet spirits intact. Reports later described hundreds of German casualties, mostly psychological, as survivors spoke of the seemingly unkillable soldiers who laughed in the face of a storm of fire. Only minor injuries had been sustained among Ivanov's men, a testament to their ingenuity and discipline. Lieutenant Sergei Morozov, 27, meticulously documented every detail: angles of the slope, trench depth, blast calculations, and defensive layouts. These notes would influence Soviet military strategy for years. Yet, the triumph felt bittersweet. Letters arrived informing them of fallen comrades in other sectors. For Ivanov, each life saved in those 12 hours was a small victory, a stark reminder that survival in war required both courage and relentless resourcefulness. Years later, in 1965, Captain Mikhail Ivanov returned to the ridge. The forest was quiet, trees had grown back, and the scars of war were faded, yet subtle mounds and hollows still marked the ground where earth had been torn. A memorial plaque stood in the center, reading, "To the men who dug uphill, defied fate, and bought time for their nation." Ivanov traced the names: Pavel, Dmitry, Sergei, Mikhail, and felt the weight of memory settle over him. Children ran and played along the ridge where rockets had once screamed, while farmers ploughed fields that had been scarred by explosions. Ivanov smiled faintly. The world had moved on. Yet the courage, ingenuity, and sheer will of one company during 12 hours of hell had left a mark no historian could erase. A distant rumble of modern artillery echoed, and, for a fleeting moment, the ghosts of Katyushas seemed to scream. But the spirit of those who dug uphill remained unbroken. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.